Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection Podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection Podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Another connection made from another guest that we previously had, and we thank Brooke Mitchell out there, wherever she may be, on Rewildology, posting stuff about bears this week. So go listen to them. If you haven't subscribed to them, please do so. If you haven't subscribed to us and you're listening to us on a whim, please like and subscribe us anywhere you listen to your podcasts. That all being said, we are joined by the founder of K9 Conservationists. They formed in 2021. She is also a IAABC certified dog behavior specialist since 2017. She is Kayla Fratt, coming to us from Corvallis, Oregon. Kayla, pleasure to meet you. How's everything going in Oregon?
Hey, yeah, it's great. The rains haven't started yet, so I'm thrilled. And yeah, really excited to be here.
I just want to, I really love that Brooke made this connection. She's such a bubbly personality, and I can see how you guys could get along really well. We were just chatting before we started recording, and really, you've had this incredible start or this incredible job with K9 Conservationists. But where did this journey begin? Because when you speak to people and they're sort of in their stuff already, it's always cool to go backwards and just say, how did I get to, as you were saying to us, getting in the dog behaviorist world and now using that for conservation? So where did you grow up? How did this all start for you?
Yeah, so I was born in Colorado. My dad worked for the Forest Service at the time. And then I was raised in Wisconsin. My dad moved over to a job in fisheries and then in county conservation. So I grew up, under the wing of a conservation biologist from day one. And my mom is actually in communications, grant writing, fundraising, which will all make sense as we go on through the story as well. So I lived on 40 acres in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. It was like a retired dairy farm. And, nature was kind of my babysitter. I was a pretty solid latchkey kid, even, in the mid 90s. And, we had chickens and rabbits, and I would go out and just like find bird nests and count eggs and then come back and check on them all the time throughout the summer and like see when they fledged and all that sort of stuff. Like I was just really, really in nature as a kid. So I don't think there was ever any doubt that I was going to go into ecology, biology, zoology, wildlife biology, something in kind of that area. And then I went off to Colorado College, and I was studying ecology there. And while I was a student at Colorado College, I started a dog training business. I did that basically as a way to kind of pay my way through school. It started out as a dog walking business, and then very quickly I got bored of that and started training instead. And I really fell in love with animal behavior at this point. I hadn't really considered it as a field that one could do. I didn't really think that like dolphin training was an actual job that one could pursue. I didn't know that dog training even existed as a job. Like the town I grew up in was so small, we didn't really have professional dog trainers in the community. And so I kind of spent a couple years not knowing what to do with that. I was thinking maybe I'll be a comparative cognition researcher. Like maybe I'll stay in academia, but look at how smart animals are and how do we know how smart they are? And like, what is intelligence anyway? And like those sorts of questions were really exciting to me. And people would ask me like why I didn't just continue with the dog training thing. I was good at it. Like, why was I looking at grad school? Why would I really consider the really challenging path of academia if I had this dog training thing? And I never had a great answer other than it just kind of didn't feel adventurous enough. It didn't quite feel tied enough to, the biodiversity crisis and climate change. I was really, really concerned about those things and still am. So then a friend showed me a YouTube video about conservation detection dogs. And this video showed, I believe, the dogs with University of Washington's Conservation Canines team sniffing out orca scat from the front of a boat in the ocean. And I lost my mind. I was like, holy crap. Like, this is what I'm going to do. Like, I've been working as a dog trainer. I want to work in ecology. I want this like adventurous, interesting life. One of the things I did really love about dog training was having that one-on-one relationship with the animals and being able to actually interact with them in person rather than like, having radio collars and, the really like less invasive monitoring techniques like didn't, they don't scratch quite the same itch. So I did what any reasonable person would do at this point, where you're like, I think I found like literally my dream job. I can't imagine anything cooler than this. And I emailed every single organization I could find and asked them, can I get an internship? Can I volunteer for you? I still had one summer between then and then my final year of school, and then I would graduate. So it was like perfect timing to get an internship or volunteer or something. And most of the organizations never emailed me back. A couple of them basically told me, sorry, no, we're not hiring. Okay, that's fine. Totally get it. Or they don't have internship programs. And then a couple of them gave me really discouraging responses. One organization told me they didn't hire dog trainers because they don't like people who kind of have that mind frame. They really wanted to be able to train you from the ground up, which to some degree I understand. But at the same time, being a 21-year-old and being told you have too much of the wrong sort of experience is really frustrating. Because it's one thing if you need to go back and learn more of something, but if you already know too much, like there's nothing to do about that really. And then another organization told me that they didn't hire people who were in relationships, which is illegal. And their reasoning for that was there's so much travel and it's such a strenuous work schedule that it kind of inevitably becomes the job or the relationship. And they were sick of having to deal with that conflict in their employees. So yeah, then I worked a bunch of other random combinations of jobs for the next like 3 or 4 years. I worked as a freelance writer. I worked as a web designer. I traveled the world a whole bunch, as people maybe, if you can, and you should in your early 20s. I worked as a dog behavior consultant. And then I kind of circled back to the world of conservation dogs. I had adopted a dog at this point who I had started to train in detection work. And I applied for a Fulbright grant to go to New Zealand and study the selection and training of conservation dogs. And kind of through the process of researching and applying for that grant, I was ultimately hired by Working Dogs for Conservation, which is one of the like biggest, oldest outfits in this world. I worked for them for just shy of 2 years, and then I'm now on my own running K9 Conservationists alongside 2 really lovely co-founders, and doing this full time. And I did end up going back to school. I'm now a PhD student kind of studying conservation dogs and wolves and genetic methods and all sorts of stuff, kind of all mushed in together.
That's wild.
Wow.
I'm still thinking about the scat. I'm still thinking about the orca
crazy.
Scat on the front. Right.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to figure out.
That is exactly. That's going to be some large that's a large stain on a boat right there. You mentioned something in sort of our pre-talk just before, and I guess it sort of circles back to what you were talking about just now. When you have the knowledge of being a dog trainer and learning these different types of tools, where then did the initiative come in for you to, or how difficult was it for you to marry these two sorts of loves together with being knowledgeable and good at dog training and also wanting to, it seems like you have this familial tree to come down and be conservation, biology, ecology. How did this track? How were you able to marry those two things? Because they do come from two different sorts of lifestyles. Yeah. And so putting those two together seems like it's not, it would sort of butt up against each other a little bit.
Yeah, they certainly can. It is a field that's hard to like dip your toe into. Once you've got a detection dog and you've trained them up, it's really hard to take like then a normal field tech position because most of those jobs don't provide dog-friendly housing and those sorts of things. I think now that we're established, it feels really natural. And on the dog training side, it's not, it both isn't that hard and is quite different. So, standard dog training, what most people learn if they're going through like the Karen Pryor Academy for Dog Trainers or something like that, which is one of the bigger ways that people can become really skilled dog trainers. You don't learn a lot about scent work and like scent theory and training detection for dogs. It's, sit, come, do leg weaves, cool tricks. It's those sorts of things. And there is a big difference when then you're working with something that we can't see, we can't perceive, and figuring out, the fluid dynamics and the airflow and how temperature and terrain and vegetation affect that for your dog and how to ensure that your dog is cued into the right parts of olfaction and not your body. It's really easy to think you've trained a dog well when they're actually just reading your body language and using, the orientation of your shoulders and whether or not you hold your breath to find what you think they're finding. So there's a lot to it, and it doesn't totally overlap with dog training easily. And then even once you're at the point where, okay, so say you've made the leap, you've got the dog, you've trained the dog, you feel good about it, you're ready to stop doing kind of quote unquote normal field tech gigs, which is like, going out and getting a summer job banding birds or counting rabbits or something like these sorts of like classic introductory wildlife biology jobs. Now you've got to actually get the jobs in the conservation dog world. And it is generally in the US, the industry is pretty contract based. So you'll work for a couple weeks to a couple months on a given contract. And then you've got a bit of a dry spell where you're grant writing, you're report writing, catching up on emails, catching up on sleep, hopefully, maybe brushing up on training and getting the dogs ready for the next project. And then you go out again. So if you're not super savvy on the business side and super good at grant writing and kind of lucky with connections and able to convince people that you are the right person to hire, you can end up in a really awkward or challenging financial position really quickly because, again, at least in the US, you're not generally like employed somewhere with a salary that kind of covers you when you're not in the field, which is not the case everywhere else. Like in Africa and Australia, it's a little bit more common. Like there's a big team with Zoos Victoria in Australia where they are staff at the zoo. So they're not grant writing as much as I am, I assume. So does that answer your question? There's a lot of different components that kind of come together. And I guess some skepticism from potential project partners can be part of it as well. Like people don't always know or trust the dogs and kind of believe that it's a good method. Or on the flip side, then people come in and think that the dogs are magical and can solve every single problem that they've ever had with their sampling protocol. And they're good, but they're not perfect.
Right.
So who are the typical clients in this field or relevant bodies, I guess, that hire this kind of service?
Yeah, that's a great question. They kind of fall, at least for us with K9 Conservationists, they fall into two main categories. So it tends to be universities. So we work with a lot of like PhD students or labs that are collecting data that might go out and serve a couple different PhD or master's students. That's a big part of what we do. And then the other big part of what we do are more kind of big industry clients. So we do quite a bit of surveys on wind farms. So then we're getting hired by like these big consulting companies that help wind farms and wind energy figure out how to reduce bird fatalities and bat fatalities on the wind farms. So then we're more working with like industry, energy, those sorts of things. There are quite a few federal projects out there as well, or state wildlife agencies. We haven't done quite as much with them yet just because we're not as established. And those are, I think, the ones where they trust expertise more than anything else.
How do dogs help reduce bird deaths on a wind farm?
Yeah, so they don't actually. You're kind of chasing the problem with the dogs. So they're finding the dead birds and bats, and then you're using that with information and big data sets on like the weather and the time of year and wind speed and precipitation and all sorts of stuff to figure out what times of years are most deadly for birds and bats. And then the wind farms, and some have voluntarily chosen to do this, will then basically turn the turbines off at those highest risk times to kind of, you want to target, you don't want to like turn the turbines off just for like 3 weeks during migration season if most of the strikes happen overnight or most of the strikes happen the first day after a rain or, whatever it is. Yeah. So it's helping in collecting the data to then target.
When it comes to dogs that are working dogs, is there a regulatory body that enforces any kind of standards for dogs that are working for a company or an entity like the dogs you work with?
There aren't, at least in this country.
That's interesting.
When you're working with a university, sometimes you have to do what's called an IACUC application. I don't remember what that stands for. Some sort of animal care and welfare protocol that you need to then get like approved by like a board within the university. We have our own like internal safety standards, and then we're a member of the Conservation Dog Alliance, which is a group that's really working on creating these sorts of things. But yeah, right now it's all voluntary. Our dogs, we joke, and it's kind of a joke and kind of an our dogs are unionized.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So like we have internal rules about like how many hours a day the dogs will work, whether or not they work in the heat, lightning, wildlife, rattlesnakes, ticks, there's all sorts of things that we have kind of internal safety protocols to mitigate risk, because the reality is we do work in areas with rattlesnakes. We do work in areas with bears, and you can never get that risk to zero, but we do everything we can to make sure that the dogs are safe and happy. And sometimes that involves getting the dogs to stop working when the dogs don't want to, and being like, no, buddy, it's time for you to go home. The situation is no longer safe for you to continue working.
What's the track, or what's the process for getting the correct dog for this type of situation? And also, when you go through that, just say a little bit about the mission too of K9 Conservation, because we didn't touch on that, about what the ultimate goal is for you guys specifically. But yeah, go into the dog aspect of how are they selected. I saw some of them are rescues, and what that training process is like.
Yeah, so I'll start with the mission question, and then we'll kind of pivot back to the dogs.
Sure.
So our mission, our tagline is dogs detecting data. So we have a twofold mission within K9 Conservationists. So one is we train and provide and deploy conservation dog teams on projects around the world. So we've worked in Kenya, we've worked in Guatemala, I currently work in Alaska. We also work in some places that aren't quite as sexy sounding, like Iowa and Wyoming. But so we do just a lot of dog training, and then we go and help people out on their projects. The other thing that we do that is rather unique within the conservation dog world, and because, I think my personal story that I just shared, you'll see why I'm so passionate about this, is we provide a ton of outreach and education for, by, and about the conservation dog community. So we're really keyed up on, we've got our own podcast that has hours and hundreds of hours at this point of free information about what to expect when working with conservation dogs, how to select dogs, like everything we can possibly do to help people who are where I was 7-8 years ago get to where I am now, and help clients understand, how to work with dogs, and maybe helping people who have never heard of the dogs understand them. So those are kind of our two big kind of separate but joined missions. And, to peek under the hood a little bit, just between the three of us, nobody else is listening right now. The other really nice thing about working, having education and outreach as a big part of our mission is, obviously I'm really extroverted and I just love this sort of stuff, but it also helps us kind of smooth over those edges over, there's usually basically from like October to March is kind of a dry spell for us. Very few places in the US want conservation dogs deployed over the winter. So that's a great time for us to be able to offer. We offer an 18-week online course where people can learn everything practical that they need to know, where people can learn everything theoretical that they need to know to kind of prepare to go out into the field. And we can offer that when we're not in the field ourselves as a way to kind of smooth over our own workflow throughout the year. So then, selecting the dogs. Within K9 Conservationists, 4 of our 5 dogs are rescues. And that is mostly because actually the sort of dog that we are looking for is the sort of dog that is really hard to live with in kind of your average suburban home that wants to take the dog on walks around the block and maybe like take him for a hike after the soccer game once a week or something like that. We are looking for the sorts of dogs that have such a high genetic drive to work and such high energy levels that they really tend to fail in normal homes, not necessarily through any fault of their own. So there's a lot of the sort of dogs we're looking for in the shelter, which is a little different from if you think like a service dog organization. Almost by definition, a dog that is highly qualified to be a service dog candidate is not a dog that's super likely to end up in a shelter. If you've got a dog that is like great at helping stabilize someone with mobility issues or like soothing autistic kids, that's a really easy dog to adopt. So even when they do end up in the shelter, they fly off the shelves. Our dogs eat cabinets to get tennis balls out, and big 6-foot tunnel systems in your backyard. So what we look for, if we're looking to hire a new dog, what we'll do is we basically have a kind of a short list of breeds and breed mixes that tend to have the sorts of traits that we like, that we're looking for. So there is a lot of variety within the field. So like my friend Lindsay Ware, she's with Science Dogs of New England. She has a Teckle, which is a wire-haired dachshund. So like there are all sorts of sizes and shapes of dogs that can succeed in this line of work, but generally what you see are herding breeds and then the flushing and retrieving hunting dogs. So you see a lot of labs, a lot of spaniels, a lot of border collies, a lot of heelers, those two groups. And basically what you get for free with those two groups is the herding dogs tend to be really responsive off leash and really responsible around prey animals. Because they've got to listen around rams and not kill lambs. So that's what a good herding dog does. We love that when we're working off leash around, elk. And then what you get for free with the labs and the spaniels is that ability to search. And what we do when we kind of have one or the two, with the other is, then you just through training try to move them into the point of being good at everything. So we've got kind of those lists. The very first step is kind of identifying a dog that seems really healthy. Generally, we're looking for kind of youngish dogs, like somewhere in that like like anywhere from 6 months to maybe 4 years old is kind of our big range. But a lot of times they're about 2, which is also one of the highest risk times for a dog to end up at the shelter. They're at like the tail end of adolescence. They tend to be really tough to live with at that age. So that's when I think the average age for a shelter dog is like 18 months.
Yeah.
So then we're looking for the healthy ones. We're looking for the ones that are kind of the right size and shape for most of our field work. So that's a dog that's not too big, that we can't carry out if it breaks a leg, and also not so small that it can't keep up. Then we're looking for a dog that's absolutely bonkers for toys. For us, also, ideally, we're looking for dogs that, get along well in multi-dog households, that can travel and stay in hotels. Like for my field work with the wolves in Alaska, we're actually working off of a boat most days. So we take a boat to get from island to island. So we need a dog who's, pretty solid with that sort of thing, not scared of men, because most boat captains that you hire are men. And that starts whittling down the shelter dogs pretty quickly. There's a lot of dogs who, for socialization or whatever other sort of reason, we start having some struggles with that. We get a lot of emails from people with dogs that absolutely could do this job, but because of fear or aggression with either other dogs or other people, we have to pass up on them because we just currently, we all have at least one dog. We're not really in a situation where we can manage those sorts of dogs. But yeah, and then with our one puppy, Niffler, he's my youngest dog. I got him in 2020, and I tried to get another shelter dog, but if y'all remember the great dog adoption frenzy of 2020, I kept having dogs like swiped from under my nose in the shelter.
Crazy.
It was crazy. So I ended up with a breeder dog and kind of did the same thing with him. When he was, I think 5 or 6 weeks old, I went and met the whole litter. So I got to play with a litter of 7 5-week-old border collie puppies. And I basically looked for the puppy that was super independent, super confident, and super interested in problem solving. And the funny thing with testing puppies is you're kind of trying to pick out from a class of kindergartners which one you want to be your lawyer. And that's a hard proposition. You might kind of look for like the loudmouth, bossy, smartass kindergartner, and that might help. But you're going to have more misses than you would if you were looking at like a class of law students.
Wow, that's a crazy way of like you said, like hiring your employees essentially. That's what's going on. Because you're hiring these like to do this. I mean, to your point, doing all this travel, being on boats and all this other stuff, what is the nature, and I use that not as a pun, but what's the nature of the research area that you all cover? Because when you look at the website, and as you stated before, you're all over the globe. So what are the situations like? Are we talking about camping outside? We're living on the boat. I saw some of your blogs where you guys were sleeping in the walkways on one of the ships or something.
Yeah, uh-huh.
So it's a pretty, you guys are out. It's like anybody. It's like you're living a range rider type life, just with dog companions or dog workers that are finding all this research. And then to piggyback off that, what are the I guess the three basic types, and I have the ones here that the kind of samples that you guys really try and collect, which are plants, animal sense, insects, mussels, and such.
Mhm.
But what are the ones that you guys really are zeroed in on as like your ones that you do really well in terms of research and samples that people are coming to you guys for specifically?
Yeah. Again, I'm going to answer the second question first.
Sure, go ahead.
First one that's in my mind, and it's I think the shorter answer. Right now, our kind of area of expertise within K9 Conservationists is bird and bat carcasses on wind farms. That's kind of our bread and butter. Those are also one of the things we love about those jobs is they're a really good introductory place where we can hire our students who have graduated from our course, and they can then start out on the wind farm. So it's a great place as like a training ground for novice dogs, novice people. It's also, again, it pays well. It's steady work. We like it. Like I genuinely kind of miss the wind farm sometimes when I'm in stats class. Like, yeah, I could do with just like a dawn on the prairie right now.
I can imagine,
Yeah.
Stats class is not exciting. I took it in college. It's not fun.
Yeah. Really. Today we had to do a t-test by hand, and I was like, I'd really rather not. But we did it, and we were brave about it. And then our other big category, again, this is kind of specifically within K9 Conservationists right now. Our other big category is predator surveys, carnivores. Carnivores tend to be the thing that we get contacted for a lot because there tends to be a lot of money in carnivore research as compared to like dormice or something, which actually are a big thing in the UK. They've got an endangered species of dormouse that conservation dogs do work on. There tends to be a lot of money, I guess, and they tend to be hard to find because they tend to have these big territories. You figure if a wolf only poops once every 8 hours, they can move miles and miles and miles in between every single one of those scats. So they tend to be pretty inefficient for people to search for without the dogs. And then I've forgotten your first question.
No, it's okay. I would because I mean, stick with the wolf stuff, I guess, for a moment, because it was really like the research areas. I mean, you guys pretty much go, it seems, all over the globe for this stuff, and I didn't realize they have dog detection in the UK, but it seems like it's a steadily climbing type of service or research technique that is sort of catching on all over the place.
Yeah.
So when you're in carnivore, you get called about carnivores, whether it's, we'll stick with wolves for the moment. What are the types of things that people are looking for you guys to help them get? Is it mostly scat samples, or is it other type of research or things that they're trying to get that they need assistance with? Yeah.
So with our carnivores, it's almost always scat. There are some detection dog teams that are trained to find live animals or other sorts of sign. But yeah, for our carnivores, it's pretty much always scat. And the reason that conservation dogs have really blown up really in our lifetimes is because in the 1990s, wildlife biology started getting good at fecal DNA extraction. Once you were able to get DNA out of poop, then all of a sudden it was valuable to find a lot of poop, and dogs are very good at that. So, conservation dogs existed before that, but they were primarily used for like game bird counts, where you would take you'd take a pointer out and you would use that dog to point out coveys of quail, and then you'd count the quail and use that to see whether or not, a given range was decreasing or increasing in population or something like that. So yeah, it's mostly the genetic material that we can find in feces. And then we can use that for a bunch of different things. So the methods for this are just getting better, like year over year. It's crazy how fast the genetic side of things is moving right now. So, back in the 90s, sometimes what they were doing is mechanically sorting poop, where you're basically like doing a bunch of rinsing and sieving and whatnot, and then taking hairs and putting them under the microscope and figuring out what that animal is eating, like really manually. Now we can do a process called DNA fecal metal barcoding, where you take a little teeny tiny spoon full of poop, like, a lentil-sized bit of poop, and you mix it with a bunch of different reagents, and you centrifuge it a bunch, then you do some PCR and beep, boop, boop. Then you figure out what that animal is eating to a really high degree, because one of the things that you miss with like that mechanical sorting is if a wolf eats a vole, you might miss all of those bones because they just get kind of dissolved enough. That hair is really tiny, but that signature will pop up in the DNA. You can also identify individuals, and then you can use that to look at like ranges. You can look at movement. If you've got a good enough genetic panel, you can also see who's related to whom and how inbred they are. And you can use that to look more at like population health and population connectivity. But that all starts with needing to have enough poop, which is where the dogs come in. So I'm now, for my PhD, I'm kind of working on the other side of like the genetic side of things and like learning how to take something that my dog has found and use that to answer questions about like connectivity, like which of these islands in Southeast Alaska are these wolves swimming between? Where are they eating sea otter and why? Now I'm learning how to dig into some of those sorts of questions for my PhD. But previously, I was just on the dog side. We just found poop. We slept on boats. When we were in Kenya, we slept in tents. When we were in Guatemala, we slept in also tents, actually. Lot of time on boats and in tents and experiencing new bugs and listening to new carnivores at night and wondering whether or not they're going to eat you.
Yeah, I'm interested in the minutia of just the logistics of this. So a dog finds wolf scat, and then what? You're using a GPS collar to locate the location, or they're healing. So when they find it, you find it, or how does it work? How do you get to where it is and then take the sample?
Yeah, so basically we'll start out with an area that we're planning on searching, whether that's like a muskeg, which is kind of like a big boggy wetland in Alaska that we know wolves like to hang out in, or we suspect they like to hang out in. Or roads or trails or something. A lot of times they're communicating with hunters and trappers and fishermen to know kind of where they've been seeing wolves. So we start with where we're searching. Then, the dog gets a GPS collar and a vest with a bell on it. Hypothetically, that bear bell may help with bears, but mostly it's actually so I can hear where the dog is in that really dense undergrowth. And then when we hear the bell stop moving, then we pull out the GPS collar and we use that to find the dog if we can't see the dog. We do tend to try to keep our dogs within visual contact. So they tend to work within, like 20 yards, 20 meters or so of us so that we can see them. And that's, again, primarily for bear safety. But that doesn't mean that we can always see them. So then we go, we find them. When the dog has found scat, what they're supposed to do is lie down with it in between their front paws. So that's called an alert. We spend a lot of time in the off season training that and cleaning that up and making sure that they know that they need to be lying down right with it, a couple meters away, doesn't cut it. And then we mark that spot on our GPS, we fill out a data sheet, and then we bag up the poop and we label it and we bring it home, and then it goes off to the lab.
Is there something they're supposed to follow that they've been trained to follow when they come in contact with a bear or another predator? Or how do they usually respond to that? Because we've heard plenty of times that a lot of times what exacerbates a potential bear attack are dogs. So how do you sort of handle that?
Yeah, so a big thing that we work on with the dogs is what we call animal interactions. We have learned quite a bit there's a woman called Simone Mueller who does predation substitute training and works on kind of teaching dogs to orient to something that they're interested in and observe it and then disengage on their own. So we don't necessarily rely on like using tools that teach the dog that chasing bears is bad. While that's a reasonable approach, we just don't use that currently with our dogs. We keep them close and we're just really aware of the situation. So we rely on the fact that we've trained the dogs to, whether it's a deer or a bunny or a bear or a wolf, when they see something, they are not to engage with it. They stop moving and ideally they return back to us. When we're in really dense bear infested areas, we make a lot of noise. And when we know we're coming up on a wolf den, because wolves are not generally super dangerous to people, as you and your listeners probably know. But they are and can be quite aggressive towards dogs. Again, particularly if we're approaching a den with puppies. A dog is a pretty direct competitor that they are not going to welcome into their den. So if we know we're going to a den, we honestly will leave the dog in the truck. But sometimes we don't know. And then we kind of start realizing that we're getting closer and closer to a den. So then I carry a big leash in my backpack and I pull that leash out and I make sure that I've got the dog on leash and I kind of reel the dog in. And then if we start hearing or seeing wolves, then again, we're putting the dog in between my legs we're in a group of 2 or 3 at this point. We'll collect the scat samples we need and then get out of there. We never had anything happen in Alaska with the dogs and with the wolves. And there were times where we could hear the wolves howling in the woods and the dog is just like, whatever, you didn't react at all. But it is something we're very aware of. And like, I spent a lot of time talking to the Alaskans in particular about like, hey, how do you all manage this? Because I've been around wolves in Wisconsin, but the density is definitely greater in Alaska. And, I've never been in a situation in which I'm bringing my dog into a wolf den previously. Right. And now it's a regular part of my job.
Wow. So to add to that same idea, so you have a new dog from a shelter. They know nothing about the work they're about to do. What's the primary list of commands or skills that a dog needs to learn or know before they can be good at this type of work?
That's such a good question. Yeah. So we start with, the basics of like, hey, can you hike off leash with me right now? And can you reliably stay close without me calling you? I don't want to have to be hassling you all the time. You need to be sticking around. You do need to be responsive if I call you. So, it's recall. We also teach what we call an emergency stop or an emergency down, which that one in particular is really useful in snake country. So if you're in a situation where you see a rattlesnake and it's in between you and the dog, you don't want the dog to come back to you when you call them, but you also don't want to not call the dog and then have the dog, naturally through their work, they tend to kind of circle back and forth to us. So then we tell them to down and they stay put and we move around the snake and then, we go do whatever we need to do. Also really useful around cars. If like an ATV comes ripping down a road that we're searching on, we can just put the dog in a down and then, they're not going to do anything foolish. We also teach them things like right and left. We teach them slow down. We teach all sorts of different commands and cues to help them like move safely with us in the field. Obviously, they need to learn what their target odor is and how to problem solve for that. So they're not tracking or trailing the wolves. It's not like we're getting to a spot where a wolf was just seen and then they're following the trail of the wolf until they find poop. They're air scenting. So they actually need to learn to like basically be navigating this world where there's no wolf scent, no wolf scent, no wolf scent. Oh, there's a blip of wolf scent. Now we need to follow that scent cone back to try to get to a point of higher and higher and higher concentration until we found it. And that's a skill that dogs do kind of naturally have within them. That's how their ancestors found food forever. But they do kind of need to practice it. If you watch nature documentaries with teenage cheetahs or wolves or whatever, they're not good at hunting at first. And our dogs need the same practice. And they need to learn what they're not looking for. We don't want our wolf detection dogs to also be finding dog poop or bear poop or anything like that. So they need to learn, hey, this is what we're looking for and not that. They need to learn to ride boats safely. Getting on and off the boat can be a little bit of an ordeal, and particularly if it's choppy, helping them understand how to do that safely and how to wait and not jump off the boat until they're ready. Because, if there's surge in that boat, then like lunges forward onto the rocks or something, like we could get a dog killed if that dog doesn't know how to wait and how to control themselves in those situations. So we take all that stuff really seriously, and there's kind of a rotating list depending on what we're going to work on. So like we've got a project coming up in South Texas with ocelots. And for that project, there's going to be someone on the team who is ringing a cowbell to deter javelinas. And so we need to get the dogs ready to search around a very loud cowbell, which we don't expect to be a problem for them, but it does mean we have to go out and train and make sure that, hey, when I'm ringing a cowbell in your face, can you still do this job? It's like, we can all podcast and focus on this right now, but if there was someone like dancing and jumping up and down on the other side of our computers, would we be as focused as we are right now? No, but if we practice, we could probably do it.
Right. How are you training for the scent specifically? Because if you're looking for a specific pack or individual or whatever it may be, are you getting samples prior to this? How do you give them the initial scent in order to say, this is where you're going?
Yeah. So right now our dogs aren't trained to find like an individual or a pack or anything. It's species specific. So they'll find any wolves, of that species. And, one of the things that would be kind of curious is like, if they hit a wolf dog hybrid, what do they think of that? I don't know. But yeah, so we get freezer full of poop.
We can send you a bunch if you need a wolf dog poop.
Honestly, we actually do.
Yeah.
We can send you a truckload if you want.
We'll be touching base about that later.
Absolutely. We got 44 of them. We can help you out with that.
Oh my God. Yeah. We desperately need some for a different training project. But yeah, ideally we're getting scat samples that are from all ages and sexes of wolves. So you don't want to accidentally only give the dogs scat from adult male wolves. And then you get out in there and they hit a pup scat for the first time and they're like, this is close, but like, it's not that close. It was drinking milk. It's like, it's a girl, whatever. It smells different. Dogs will sometimes kind of make that error if we're not careful about introducing them to enough variety. So yeah, you get a freezer full of poop. And then I have these little, we call them scent snorkels. So it's like an elbow for PVC. That I can screw onto a piece of plywood, and then we can put the scat sample in a glass jar below that. And then the dogs are we've got a bunch of those. So then the dogs can learn to like check that whole series of scent snorkels, find the correct one, select the correct one, and get rewarded for that. And that's also how we introduce what we call our discriminatory stimuli, which is like, hey, so if one of these tubes has wolf scat in it and one of them has chicken in it, do you pick the right one? If one of them has dog scat in it, do you pick the right one? If one of them has your favorite toy in it, do you pick the right one? And we use that to kind of introduce the concept of like, this is exactly what we're looking for. And here's how we're going to practice it.
Wow.
Okay. So, I mean, I don't know if this information exists, but if it does, I'm sure you know. What are they smelling? I mean, in wolf scat that tells them that it's not lion scat or coyote scat or fox scat. What's the thing in feces that is so specific to a species that it can be identified?
Oh, this is the fun part of conservation dog work. We have no idea.
That's what I thought.
Not a clue. So
Wow.
If you talk to like a drug dog handler, they know the specific compound that is volatile in cocaine that is what dogs smell. And I think cocaine specifically, you can actually use that compound instead of the whole drug because it's such a good signature. Don't quote me on that too much if you're like trying to train a drug dog.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have no idea. Yeah. And it's actually the same thing with human remains detection dogs. We don't actually know specifically what it is that tells a dog exactly what they're looking for. And the crazy thing is, like, we've got videos of Barley finding scats that are clearly months old. Like they've got moss growing on them. And you would think that would smell pretty different from a scat that is like basically fresh.
Wow.
That's really
But
weird
there's something still in there that they're able to pick up on.
I mean, it's similar to when we talk to the biologists and they talk about, because all of us, I think, on here know that wolves or most predators are going to look for the sick and the weak, right? So in the herd and whatever it is, to be able to, because to the naked eye, I would think for humans, that is a very difficult way to try and figure out, oh, this elk is clearly hurt, sick, whatever it is, but it may walk around and it's like, well, that seems like a normal elk to me.
Unless it's crazy advanced, like where they're...
Of course.
Because
but that's what I mean. If we're talking
before that.
That's what's insane to think about is that their sense of smell is so good that there's something they're detecting. They're detecting a sickness or a weakness that they're like, oh, Ed over there, he's done. Yeah. Like we're gonna go for Ed because he's got a limp in the back. Like it's just insane because Stephen and I saw this in Yellowstone. It was clear when the elk were running.
Right.
But I don't know if prior to the elk running that they all sort of scented like, hey, there's a group of elk down there, and we found it, and there's one that we can get to.
Yeah.
Which is nuts. And the same thing, I guess, with the scat question that Stephen asked, right?
It's weird.
What is the marker? Yeah. Like you said, for them to deter away from bear scat, from lion scat, from whatever, and say, nope, I found the wolf pup, not the wolf adult or whatever you guys are searching for.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And one of the things we do see is sometimes when you're working with like closely related species that have similar diets, it is hard for them. When we worked in Kenya, a big part of that project was helping the dogs understand, yes, cheetah, no leopard, no caracal, which are like two other wild cats that actually have quite a bit of dietary overlap with cheetah. And you've got to imagine, they're all cats, they're all eating similar stuff. There's basically no doubt that the dogs can tell the difference, but they do need kind of additional training to find that difference. And I will say one of the things, like, so when I used to work at an animal shelter, right? And one of my big jobs there, so I was worked both with dogs and with cats. And, people say that cats are really moody, they're really temperamental, they're really hard to read. When you spend 10-hour days, 2 days a week, because we had 4 10-hour shifts a week, working with aggressive and fearful cats, you start being able to pick up on the fact that, hey, I'm actually going to stop petting this cat right now because I'm going to get swatted. And there are things, you can learn it in a book. You can start looking for the whisker flare, the pupil dilation, the ear set, like really little, like, did it just lick its lips? Like, and you can start picking up on it academically, or you can pick up on it through experience. And I'm sure the wolves, a huge part of it is experience, because I don't think they're reading textbooks on, here are the 15 signs of a weak elk, but I'm sure that they're able to kind of, pick up on like, that one's got a slight roll in their hip, like,
oh yeah,
there are things that you can pick up on through expertise, even as humans. I'm sure that an elk researcher would be better at this than we are.
Yeah.
No, yeah, it definitely just has to do with the amount of, I know horse people who, I love horses, but I see a horse, I just see a horse. I'm like, that. They say, oh, that horse has gained a lot of weight. I think it's the same to me as it did last year.
Right.
My lady does the same thing where she'll see a horse across a field and she'll say, ah. And I'll say, what? She's like, that horse is so lame. And I'm like, that horse it's a mile away.
Yeah.
But she can see it from seriously so far. So I don't know. I imagine.
And I suppose also when your life depends on it, you get really, if every time you rode a lame horse, the horse buckled under your weight and rolled on top of you and broke your leg, you would probably figure out how to identify a lame horse real quick.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It's wild.
Yeah.
It's got to have something to do with like the gut biome of individual species or something, and just how it interacts with whatever they eat. And it just has to be so nuanced.
Yeah. Well, and again, one of the things we see is like, so we kind of think of it almost if you've got like a picture that you're kind of filling in pixels for. If you give the dogs not quite a complete enough picture, this is really common with like our omnivores. So if you've got a bear scat detection dog, this can be a big thing. If, for example, you pick up all your scat samples in, let's say, April, when the bears have just come out and they're eating a ton of grass, or maybe all in October when they're like, if they're in Alaska, they're chowing down on salmon, or maybe if you're, a little further south, they're eating a lot of berries. And then the dog is introduced to a scat of a bear that has got a carcass and it's all meat. Like, some dogs will actually really struggle with that generalization because there is something about the diet there. Some dogs are don't struggle with making that leap quite as much. And some of that is kind of a personality thing. Some of it's kind of a training expertise thing. But I know when the fawns came out this spring in Alaska, I was a little worried to see, okay, Barley's been doing really well with bear scat. He's been staying off of it. He's just on wolves. He's been so good. And then the fawns come out, and that means that the bears are starting to eat fawns. And I was like, all right, what's going to happen when we run into our first bear scat that is full of deer meat? Because all of the wolf scats are full of deer meat. And he did double check it. He checked it for a little bit longer. He thought about it, and then he moved on, which was cool to see. And if he hadn't, that's okay. We would have used it as a training experience. It wouldn't have been like a big deal, but it was cool to see that, like, all right, he's got enough of a picture there. He's got enough pixels filled in that he was able to say, hey, this is the same color, but it's not the same shape, or, whatever it is. And not like that he's analyzing it visually, but we use visual metaphors for people because we're crazy visual as a species.
Right. Man,
yeah.
Just think about what's going on in their brains to make those
it's
discrepancies
incredible to watch. And there were times where we used Barley to double check ourselves. Like, there were times where we found a scat from a bear cub that had meat. And, myself and my tech would be standing over it, with our hands on our hips being like, I just don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's bear. It's bear, right? And we're just like, we're not sure. So we'd go get Barley out of the truck and ask him. And he'd be like, yep, it's bear. Or like there were a couple times where he was like, no, you idiots. Like, sure, it had a bit of grass in it, but the wolf just had an upset tummy. It's definitely a wolf.
Wow. So, well, has there been any experimentation about whether any amount of the dog's identification happens with their eyes, like before their nose, meaning experimentation to see if they can identify scat or at least quintessential scat? Because like you're saying, like if I see bear scat after they've eaten meat, I definitely am wondering whether it's bear or not. But if I see a bear scat after it's eaten what looks like berries for weeks, it's very obvious that it's bear scat. But has there been any experimentation about whether they use their eyes at all? Like that
Not
doesn't look like,
no.
No, yeah.
But what we have seen is occasionally, so we did a lot of our surveys on closed logging roads because the wolves use those as highways. They, use them to take shortcuts all across the islands. And occasionally there would be like a clod of moss or an overturned rock or something that looked a little poopy. And you would see Barley kind of go over and check it. So there was an aspect of like he was using his eyes a little bit. And sometimes he would get, even just like still a couple meters away and then move away because he could tell that he wasn't getting any odor out of it. But yeah, and I will say like that happened for the most part on the roads where there's enough kind of visual contrast for that to be possible versus like when the wind farms and the grass is up to our hips. I don't think they're using their eyes hardly at all because your eyes are useless in that situation. I mean, that's why the dogs get used on wind farms so much.
Yeah, they have so many receptors inside of the nose. I mean, I'm sure from a biology standpoint, just how many things are going through the nostrils. I guess it's kind of like an offbeat question, but because you were just talking about filling in the pixels of a picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for you and for K9 conservationists, where do you feel you guys sit in the conservation space because of the work that you guys do? It's such, granted, it's something that, as you've explained, is exploding, let's just say over the last decade for sure, has like really expanded research. Where do you feel as though you guys fit into that puzzle of conservation and biodiversity to expand research and to help get these answers that people are looking for?
Yeah, I think the coolest thing about the conservation dog world right now is the ability to pair dogs as like a novel application and just get so much more data on such a finer scale for so many species. So, again, we're talking about how fast these molecular methods are improving and the DNA and the ability to identify individuals and look at inbreeding and gene flow across, the entirety of a continent in some cases. That's only useful if we have enough samples. And particularly as conservation is moving towards these like less invasive methods. If you look at conservation papers from 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, the vast majority of it was pretty hands-on. You're darting animals, you're trapping animals, you're putting collars on them, you're physically monitoring them. And we're really trying to move towards approaches that have more data, but less impact with those animals. And I think dogs are a really key part of that migration. One of the other things I really love about the conservation dog world is it's a really cool way for community scientists to get involved. We have a lot of people in our student group who do this kind of part-time on the weekends. They volunteer. They are just able, they've got a dog and they've got the chutzpah for it, and they're able to participate in small ways on their local scale as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different kind of niches they fit into. But again, like particularly these big data genetic methods, they're only as good as the samples that you've got. And dogs are really, really good at getting a lot of samples in tough situations. Like, going to our fieldwork in Guatemala, there the dogs were trained to find, I think it was 7 different species of carnivore scat. So everything from jaguars all the way down to margays and tyras, which are like a cool little like mustelid. We found 13 times as many scat as the humans did while we were there, because you can't see anything. And also cats famously bury their poop. So that makes it really hard if you're searching visually. And yeah, you can spend all the time and money you want on these like big learning models and like using AI and bioinformatics and like these molecular methods and SNP panels and like all of these amazing cool buzzwords that are happening in quantitative ecology right now. But they're only as good as the samples you've got. And yeah, that's where the dogs really come in handy.
It's such a great connection that you have because you're employing the domestic version of the wild cousin with which you're trying to find. And so it only seems natural that that would help in the scientific research of more of the wild cousin, the wild, descendant and, or the, where the domestic part came from. You have to have a story that is stuck in your brain from doing this research with, is there anything that sticks out or any one in particular experience, specifically looking for wolf scat or being in wolf country up there with Barley or any of the other dogs that sticks out in your brain that is one of those that, you have this blog and obviously we'll have the website in the description for you guys to look at, but what's one that sticks out in your brain that just is one you tell around the campfire or when you're sitting in the hallway or whatever it is?
Yeah, well, don't tell Barley this, but it's actually one that doesn't involve him all that much. And that was the first wolf den we found. So we were on this island in Alaska. We've been out for a couple weeks at this point, and hadn't yet found a den, hadn't yet found, we'd seen one wolf at this point. And we get out onto a road and it's just like, our boat captain calls these poops greasy. They're so fresh. He'd be like, "Oh, we got a bunch of greasy bombs out there." That's the lingo if you want to be really cool about finding wolf scat. And it's like there's one every couple of meters. It's just like the place is covered. So it's at the point where we've put Barley back in the truck because we're like, we don't need him right now. Like, let's just let him sleep. We're walking from one scat to the other. And then Michael, our boat captain, is just driving the car really slowly behind us because that's how dense they are. And at one point, he's stopped. It's been like this for maybe 100 meters or so. And he stops. He kind of looks out into the woods and he howls. And the woods around us just erupted with howls. And I'm sure it was like 3 or 4 individuals, but it's amazing how, this, if you've been around them, how it sounds like so many wolves. I guess if you've got 44, it genuinely is so many. But so these wolves are howling like crazy. They don't stop. We keep picking up scats and they just, it's probably 15 or 20 minutes of continuous howling as we keep picking up our scats. We eventually go and we're like, okay, we don't want to find the den right now. We're still at this point, probably at least 100 meters away. And we don't want to go right up to it because the wolf puppies at this point are probably somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks old. We don't want to disturb them. There's no point in doing that right now. All it's going to do is stress the parents out and potentially make them move the den, which is not good for anybody. But we want to get a camera trap up. So we're starting to put a camera trap up. We're trying to put it, again, far enough away from the den that it's not upsetting to them, but close enough that we'll get information as they're coming and going. And a young black wolf kind of pops up over the rise and like looks at us and then goes away and starts howling again. And it was just like such a cool interaction. And also being able to see like, they know we're there. They know we're close to their kiddos. They're interested in us. They're watching us, but they weren't threatening, really. We were able to kind of interact with them in this really, really amazing way. And we were all crying, like just standing there listening to the wolves howling and just being like, yeah, this is it. This is amazing. Like, this is so cool to get to experience.
I didn't ask this either. That story is fantastic. We've had a lot of these stories where these wolves are popping up out of the woods or they're tracking and all of a sudden they just like come upon them, and it's just so wild to hear these things from firsthand experience. Are you all studying in your area in Alaska? Are we talking about grays and timbers mostly, or sea wolves also, or do you go back in between? Because when you talk about going from island to island, I immediately think of island of sea wolves. So is that your territory? I know you said he was a little bit north of that. So are we talking what type of wolves, I guess, is
Yeah,
is
so
my
we're
question.
in the Alexander Archipelago, which is in the very, very southernmost part of Alaska. It's just north of the island of Haida Gwaii. So if you kind of find Vancouver Island, then you see the next big island up, that's Haida Gwaii. And then the next big island up there is Prince of Wales Island. So that's the main island in our archipelago. And the wolves in this area are actually a separate subspecies. It's the Alexander Archipelago wolf, so Canis lupus lygoni. They're behaviorally quite similar to, yeah, if you've seen Island of the Sea Wolves, you're looking at pretty similar behavior and movement and even similar look. They're kind of these funny little like tawny, scrawny little wolves. They've got these very silly summer coats that are not like the big fluffy timber wolves that we're used to thinking of from like Alaska, or not from Alaska, sorry, from like Yellowstone. Yeah, so very similar, but technically a different subspecies.
Wow. And that's got to be different too when you're looking at scat and you're looking at these. Do you see any differences? I don't know if you can speak to it in the formation of the scat because of their diets, because of those things. Is there any major differences that you see? Yeah, I saw you light up when I said that.
Yeah. I mean, so if they're eating deer, no. I mean, yeah, it looks the same as deer or as wolf poop just about anywhere else, I would imagine. But they do eat a lot of sea otters. And when a wolf has eaten sea otter, their poop is almost like felty. So you know, like those little felted animals people will make. It's like that. So the sea otter hair is like so dense that then, you know, when we're trying to pull out our little like spoonful for our PCR tubes, sometimes it like unravels like you're trying to pull apart a t-shirt or something. So that's really interesting. And it's really like the first time we found one, it was like, oh, this is what they were talking about with sea otter scat. Like as soon as we found one, we knew what it was, because they're really different. And these wolves will also eat some mollusks and chitin and some of these other kind of like surf and turf items. So sometimes you'll find like crab claws in there or, you know, bits of shell or something like that. Not as much as like there's sometimes we would get fooled by river otter or bear scat. They tend to have a lot more mollusks in there, but the wolves will eat them occasionally. But yeah, the really cool ones are the sea otter ones, which, you know, cool as in, you know, you're still pulling apart pieces of poop, but you know, you got to get your thrills where you can.
Are you guys able to track their hunt? Or is your research of what you're able to collect able to pick out their hunting patterns, or is it simply just genetic stuff? I don't know how deep you guys can actually go with what you're able to find. Is it more of that, or territory wise, or is it not really about hunting patterns and such?
Yeah, so we'll be able to get some info on hunting or on territory in that like we're surveying enough islands that we'll be able to say, all right, these individuals seem to use these islands and not these islands. You know, hopefully we've got enough sample size that we're kind of able to say that. We're obviously not checking. There's over 1,000 islands, so we're not checking every single one of them. And then we're able to kind of get at the hunting pattern sideways in that we're looking at their diet. So we can say what they're catching and what they're eating. We can't necessarily say what their like hunting strategy is or how they're using the environment or how they're moving. Because, you know, unlike a GPS collar, so there's kind of different types of richness of the data. Like with a GPS collar, you know that animal's movements, you know its location, but you don't always know exactly what it's eaten. We know what they've eaten, but we don't know where they were 2 hours before that. We don't know where they came from. We don't know how they got there. We don't know where they go and hang out for the afternoon. You know, we don't have collared wolves in this particular project. Some other projects do combine scat dogs and collars, or scat dogs and camera traps, or all three. But this particular project, we do have camera traps up, and then we're using the dogs, but we don't have collars, so we don't have some of those finer scale individual data.
Yeah. I know we saw, and this was something I know, Stephen, that interested you when we were talking with Tom Gable, when they were talking about wolves eating beavers, and they actually caught it on camera for like the first time. And it was there's going, I think, at some point come a time where we see these wolves actually hunting otter, and like that's going to be the next big like viral nature moment of like, how did this actually happen?
Yeah,
And how
I
are
know
these
they've
wolves
got
actually doing this
pictures of
stuff?
it. It's crazy. But yeah, that I know that beaver video you're talking about. It's wild. It's so I can't believe the luck of having gotten that on film. Um, yeah, I know I've heard of people who have seen successful otter hunts. And basically, so the wolves aren't getting on them when they're in the water. To be clear, they're not like swimming out and catching an otter on its home turf. No way. Um, but they are. So these otters in California really don't come out of the water, basically at all. In Alaska, they do. Usually, it seems like when it's rough, they basically leave the water when it's storming. They're getting beat up. So they'll come out. They also seem to come out to rest. It's probably partially a thermoregulation thing because it is just so cold up there. Though they actually don't really know exactly why. Anyway, so they come out of the water. And sometimes you'll have a raft of like 40 or 50 of them all up on land at the same time. And sometimes it's just one or two. And what people who have seen this tell me, so like my roommate, Ellen Dimmitt, studies wolves in Katmai and Glacier Bay in Alaska. And she has seen, I'm not sure if she's seen an actual hunter or if she's just seen evidence of it, but they'll basically do like a pincher move where they come in and cut the otters off from the water. Wow. And they're real clumsy. Yeah. They're a little bit more graceful than a seal, but like, not by a whole lot. When you think of like river otters and they're sliding around, they're real cute. Sea otters are not that good on land. They're really, really awkward. So I think from there, it's actually pretty easy if you can cut them off from the water.
Man, this is insane stuff. I love it. So the best place, Kayla, because you guys do so much. So you have field work, you have the podcast, you have your blog. What's the best resource for anybody who's listening to this who wants to learn more about the research you're doing, canine conservation, how to get involved? What are the tools that people can look at or the places people can go to find out all this information? Maybe contact you if they're interested, because you're such a wealth of information, and your team, obviously, about how to be involved in this type of research and helping these types of these dogs maybe get placed or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think the best starting point is going to be our website. So if you go to that and you're interested in learning more from like you're kind of interested in this line of work, there's a big button that says Aspiring Handlers This Way. And that's where you'll go, where it'll talk about like we've got a Patreon where we do monthly coaching calls where everyone gets together and shares video of them training their dogs, and you can all learn from each other. It's super positive and friendly. You can also sign up for like the course. And then there are we've got kind of a curated group of podcast episodes to start with. So, there are episodes on how to get into this field, like what background people have. There are whole episodes on selecting dogs and basic training. And we can kind of guide you through that. I would really recommend, if you're super interested, before you email me, listen to those episodes of the podcast, because otherwise I will tell you, hey, you've sent me six questions. I love it. I love the enthusiasm. However, I have already recorded 1 hour answers to each of those questions. Please go listen to the podcast and then come back to me. I'm always happy to talk to people, but I also am not going to answer questions that I've already answered on the show. So start with the website, and then the podcast is a really good place to get all of those more specific questions answered. And if you really have a burning question that you don't see addressed on the podcast, please email me about it, because I would love to answer the question. And then that tells me that we've got a gap in the podcast, and I'll, get a guest lined up and we'll get it recorded.
Totally. Last question for you is, when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
Ooh. The funny thing is, the first thing that comes to mind to me is like those really amazing kitschy shirts of like the wolf howling at the moon. They're kind of like mottled blue and purple in the background. Those. And then I think I honestly, I kind of think of controversy. I grew up in northern Wisconsin, and, I had friends who were hog farmers, and I was obsessed with wolves and just thought they were like the coolest thing in the world. And I had neighbors who, would have preferred if they were allowed to shoot wolves on site. So I think like it's kind of this combination of like wonder and majesty, and then being aware of the fact that it's kind of a controversial thing. It's not like butterflies, where I think we can all kind of agree butterflies are fantastic.
I love that answer, though, and you've dived so well into this. We are going to have all that information in the description, so please go there. Go to their website. Kayla Fratt, just thank you so much for your energy and your information, your stories. This has really been fantastic. Thanks for everything you guys are doing up there. It's really great.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. No, thank you all so much. And I know you were just saying you get invited too many places, but if you or any of your listeners want to come hang out with us in Alaska, we've got an opportunities tab on our website, and we are accepting people to come up and shadow us over the summer. And they can just come hang out.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in that, do check that out. And we'll be kind of starting to organize that coming up in the spring. I won't be in Alaska until late April, and it's very rainy. So, take that invite with the grain of salt that bring your Dramamine and bring your rain gear.
Nice. I love it. Let's get on some boats, people. It's I want to see orca scat. That's the one thing.
We didn't see any of that. We did see orcas every so often, but not as much as one would hope, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know. They're fantastic.
They're so cool.
They're so awesome.
When you search orca scat in Google, the first video is this dog is trained to sniff out and locate whale poop.
Yep.
Gotta go. Gotta watch.
That's probably the video that I saw. Like that's my that video was my moment.
Oh man. We found it. We found Kayla's moment.
Yeah.
Holy cow. That's
my
terrific.
gosh. Well, thank you both so much.
No, you've been great. Really appreciate it. Just hang tight while we sign off. How's Teal out there? Be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.